Ukraine invasion was doomed from day one. The country was unprepared for war and made not one, but two fatal mistakes. Underestimated the enemy and overestimated its own forces. Those aren't the words of some pro-Ukraine politician or Western think tank. They're the words of one of Russia's most experienced military generals, a man who was, barely a decade ago, charge of the country's entire ground forces, Vladimir Chirkin, in a rare, remarkable display of one of a high-ranking Russian official refusing to toe the Kremlin line. Chirkin recently sat down with the Russia radio outlet RBC, turning on Vladimir Putin and admitting that the war with Ukraine was never going to pan out the way that the Russian president had hoped. Interview, which was shared on RBC's website on November 27, featured retired Colonel General Chirkin as a special guest alongside retired Colonel of the Central Office of the Ministry of Defense, Vladimir Chirkin. Shortly after Putin proposed a new program aimed at providing modern Russian weapons to forces of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, a military alliance of 6 post-Soviet states, namely Armenia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Russia, and Tajikistan. Announcing his plan at the recent CSTO summit in Bishkek, spoke of how Russian weapons have proven their effectiveness in real combat, presumably referencing the war in Ukraine. RBC intended to discuss this announcement with 2 esteemed and experienced military guests, educating listeners on what kinds of weapons Russia uses today and how the country's armed forces have changed and evolved in recent years and since 2022. Particular. This sort of discussion is commonplace on many Russian radio stations. It's like Chirkin are typically invited on to share the benefits of their experience and wisdom. Many of these high-profile figures also understand the importance of following the Kremlin playbook, up the country's military and avoiding saying anything that could be classed as controversial or critical of Russia's leadership. In this case, however, Chirkin decided he wasn't going to hold back. Mere minutes into the interview, the former Russian ground forces commander launched his first attack on the country's military forces and leadership. I believe Russia was once again not ready for the war. Previous wars in the last century, traditionally, the enemy was underestimated and our own forces were overestimated. Of course, is absolutely correct. The war is closing in on its 4th anniversary. It was never supposed to last anywhere near this long. As the much larger, wealthier, and theoretically stronger nation, Russia was expected to annihilate its opponent in no time. It was well known as one of the world's mightiest military superpowers, with extensive experience of carrying out campaigns across the globe. It boasted of some of the toughest tanks, the most destructive missiles, the fastest fighter jets, and the most explosive artillery systems on the planet. Meanwhile, certainly did not have a reputation as being any sort of major military power. It didn't have anywhere near the same sort of defense budget as Russia, nor did it have the enormous army, or seemingly endless supplies and stockpiles of Soviet-era tanks, missile systems, bombs, and ammunition. On paper, this was an immensely uneven matchup, with Russia seemingly guaranteed to steamroll over any of the defenses that Ukraine might be able to muster. But war isn't fought on paper. That's the mistake that Russia made, as Chirkin so perfectly points out. The Kremlin bought into its own hype. Its leaders, like Putin, have spent so much of their time hyping up their tanks, their troops, their ships, their jets, and everything in between. Built up this almost indefatigable, invincible image for the Russian army, making it out to be the biggest, best, most unbeatable force history has ever seen, ready to march over any border and into any territory and dominate any opponent in its way. In reality, while the Russian army is certainly no pushover, and the Red Army of the Soviet Union in particular was one of the greatest and most influential armed forces that ever existed, playing a pivotal role in defeating Nazi Germany during World War II, Kremlin's forces aren't nearly as strong as Putin and his loyal lackeys claim them to be. The past 3 years have proven that fact beyond any shadow of doubt. Russia has struggled massively in Ukraine. It has suffered catastrophic losses, with a recent report from the United Kingdom's Ministry of Defense suggesting that over 1.1 million of Moscow's troops have now been either killed or injured since the invasion began in February 2022. 332,000 of those casualties have come in 2025 alone. The casualty rate has even risen in recent months, with the Modi writing, Russia's casualty rate in October 2025 has been steadily increasing, surpassing 1,000 daily casualties every day from October 5 through to October 12. Russia has also suffered tremendous losses in terms of assets and equipment as well. Again, this is all well documented with numerous official sources and open source intelligence groups like Oryx, noting that the Kremlin has seen thousands upon thousands of its tanks, armored vehicles, air defenses, radars, artillery systems, and other pieces of hardware blown to bits by Ukrainian drones, missiles, mines, and more. And much of this comes down to the fact that, as Chirkin states, Russia was not properly prepared for this war, but entered it with an unmerited sense of arrogance and entitlement. Putin and his commanders thought that invading Ukraine would be a piece of cake. They predicted a quick and easy victory, with some soldiers even ordered to pack parade uniforms before marching over the border, believing that they'd be raising the Russian flag over the streets of Kiev in a matter of days. As Chirkin notes, everyone, as you remember, started saying on February 24 that the war would end in 3 days. We'll finish them all off right away. Again, this is completely accurate. Chirkin says in this interview is untrue, or some sort of conspiracy, as his key factual claims are consistent with other sources. It's cold, hard facts, the kind that we rarely hear from Russian officials, who tend, instead, much of their airtime praising Putin and parroting Kremlin propaganda. While some of the more rational minds in the Russian ranks may have had their doubts, many soldiers, commanders, ranking Kremlin officials truly believed that the war, or special military operation, as likes to call it, would be over and done within no time. They foresaw a speedy victory with minimal losses, similar to their famous 5-day war with Georgia, which saw Russia occupy several regions of Georgia in a matter of days back in 2008. Chirkin also alluded to this in his interview, saying the Tbilisi syndrome and the events of the 5-day war with Georgia also played a role. In other words, the Kremlin seemingly felt that if it had been able to invade Georgia and take away its territories with minimal resistance, why shouldn't it be able to do the same in Ukraine? Its forces could roll over the border. The 4 territories Vladimir Putin initially targeted, namely Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk, and Zaporizhia, and expand Russia's size, power, and influence all within a week or 2 at the most. But no 2 wars are ever quite the same. There are so many factors to take into account, so many variables that ebb and flow as time goes by. It's not because one war was quick and easy that every subsequent invasion will follow the same pattern. Once more, this was proof of Russia's remarkable arrogance and misplaced confidence back when it began the war with Ukraine. Ties neatly into what Chirkin said in his first comment about Russia underestimating its opponent. Clearly, the Kremlin felt that even if the Ukrainian military decided to defend their land and battle back against the invading force, the Russian war machine would be far too mighty, overwhelming its opponents with ease. Indeed, for a very brief period in 2022, that's exactly what seemed to be happening. In the early weeks of the war, Russian forces advanced rapidly from multiple directions, gaining ground with relative ease and winning big battles in places like Bucha and Mariupol. Thanks to its early successes, Russia at one stage controlled around 27% of Ukrainian territory and seemed likely to capture the 4 regions it wanted, if not more. Then, started to turn. Fueled by a deep, desperate desire to protect its people and safeguard its sovereignty, Ukraine's military proved far stronger and more resilient than anyone, including Russia, could ever have expected. Multitudes of civilians also took up arms to join the cause, playing their part in protecting their homeland and fending off Moscow's invaders. 2022, through a mixture of grit, determination, and shrewd strategy, Ukraine had retaken large parts of the land that Russia had originally captured, reducing the Kremlin's control to less than 20% of the country. That's largely how the situation has remained in the years that have followed. Of course, Russia has managed to capture some slivers of land here and there and continues to do so in certain areas along the front lines, but its forces are making progress at a snail's pace, losing massive amounts of assets and personnel to capture only the smallest patches of muddy farm, fields and abandoned, crater-strewn settlements. All of this happened because Russia went into the war believing it had already won. As Chirkin went on to note, a large part of that belief was based on utterly inaccurate information provided by the Kremlin's intelligence agencies. I would give all of Russia's intelligence services a poor rating. I would say that the state authorities received false information that 70% of the Ukrainian population was on our side and 30% against. Out to be exactly the opposite. What did that lead to? We already know. Literally. Within the first week, we learned a cruel lesson. This, too, was one of the big stories of the war in its early stages. In fact, even before the war began, when Russia was still building its forces, up by the borders of Ukraine, news reports were already highlighting the power of the Kremlin's propaganda in influencing how Russian people viewed their Ukrainian neighbors. State-backed media outlets had, for some time, sharing tales of how terrible life had become in Ukraine, and especially its eastern regions. They spoke of so-called Nazis and other evil forces taking control of the country and wreaking havoc on its people, leading many Russians, including those in the armed forces, to believe that they would be greeted like heroes and liberators once they stepped over the border. They imagined poor, miserable Ukrainian families throwing themselves at their feet, thanking them for saving their lives and freeing them from terrible oppression. Putin was reportedly duped, as reported early on in the invasion by numerous officials, like the United Kingdom's Defense Secretary at the time, Wallace, who told reporters, President Putin believed that these people would welcome him as a liberator. He was convinced in his own mind and his own writings that the Russians and the Ukrainians were the same peoples, and all were waiting for was the great Tsars or the president of Russia to come and liberate them. And of course, when you make that assumption, all the decisions that we see playing out on our television screens, which is a sort of arrogant armed forces that has got bogged down, prepared young junior soldiers, because the officers just thought this was going to be much easier than it was. We see equipment in the wrong places. I think that's why he is carrying on as he does. It didn't take long for the truth to be revealed. Within days of the invasion starting, reports emerged of Russian prisoners of war airing their frustration, claiming that they had been duped by their government, with one officer stating, "Frankly speaking, they tricked us. Everything we were told was a fake. I would tell my guys to leave Ukrainian territory. We've got families and children. I think 90% of us would agree to go home." Some admitted, had entered Ukraine believing that it was nothing more than a minor military exercise, not a full-scale war or invasion. They didn't expect any resistance. Indeed, many believed that they would be greeted with flowers and cheers, not guns and bombs. As Chirkin notes, the biggest culprit behind this misinformation was the Federal Security Service, Russia's top intelligence agency and the modern successor to the Soviet-era KGB. According to reports, FSB agents were so confident that Russia's invasion of Ukraine would be swift and successful, that in the days leading up to forces crossing the border, the agency spent much of its time preparing safe houses and accommodations in Kyiv ready for the new members of the pro-Russian government it intended to install. It believed that Ukraine would pose almost zero resistance, that Russian troops would march to Kyiv, seize control of the city, overthrow the country's president Volodymyr Zelensky, and transform Ukraine into another of Kremlin's countries like Belarus. Evidently, the SB's assessments were way off. As for how the agency, which has a fearsome reputation all over the world, managed to misread the situation so badly, that remains a mystery, even to experts. William B. Taylor Jr., former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, who said, if your security services put such a high priority on understanding Ukraine, your military plan is based on that understanding, how could they have gotten it so wrong? How could they have assumed the Ukrainians wouldn't fight? President Zelensky would not resist so valiantly. The disconnect has to be somewhere between the FSB and the very. Regardless of how or why it happened, the FSB provided completely erroneous information. Information gave Russia's armed forces an entirely undue sense of confidence. That sense of confidence led to countless mistakes in the early stages of the invasion, which in turn leads us up to the present day, in which Russia continues to lose soldiers and assets at an alarming rate, has been cut off from large parts of the international community, and is deep of an economic crisis. All of that because of incorrect information and a simple lack of planning. Also took the opportunity to make a jibe at former Russian defense minister Sergei Shoigu. He noted how, once Ukraine began to defend itself and push the Kremlin's forces back, Shoigu was forced to abandon plans to capture Kyiv, claiming that the country was making a gesture of goodwill by easing operations around the Ukrainian capital. In reality, Chirkin notes, Kremlin was simply scrambling to save face, adding, how many dead and wounded we left there, only our army knows. As mentioned earlier, everything Chirkin said is true, grounded in reality and backed by evidence. Yet the fact that he made these kinds of statements, incredibly shocking, because this isn't normal. Russian officials, politicians, and especially members of the military, both active and retired, almost never openly criticize the Kremlin or its decisions. They follow an unwritten but strict code of conduct, always praising Putin, never undermining his authority, continuing to push whatever concepts or talking points best align with the Kremlin's agenda. And if someone does deviate from the norm, are almost inevitably punished for it. Indeed, the very act of publicly criticizing the war in Russia can lead to serious criminal charges, ranging all the way up to 15 years behind bars for those deemed the most obtuse offenders. In 2022 alone, according to data from Amnesty International, 25,000 people were penalized for either criticizing the war or spreading information regarded as false or misleading by the state. Since then, Russia has tightened its rules and regulations to more easily and aggressively prosecute dissidents and silence critics, designating thousands of media outlets, activists, celebrities, and other figures with labels like foreign agents, terrorists, or undesirable organizations. As a result, many Russians, even those who vehemently oppose Putin and the war, are now frightened to speak out for fear of being imprisoned, or worse. And Chirkin isn't just any random Russian citizen. He's an esteemed officer, a man with close to 4 decades of military experience who dedicated his life to first the Soviet and then the Russian army, rising up the ranks to achieve one of the highest positions of power as commander of Russian ground forces in 2012, before being relieved of his duties by Putin in 2013. When a man like Chirkin speaks, people listen, which is what makes it all the more astonishing that he made the bold decision to make these statements and speak so openly about the Kremlin's arrogance, the FSB's incompetence, and the military's foolishness. Doing so, Chirkin may have put his own reputation, safety, and future in jeopardy, and could soon find his name added to foreign agent or terrorist lists. But clearly, those threats and fears weren't enough to stop him speaking the truth. If more high-ranking Russians can follow his example, owning their country's mistakes and laying the blame where it belongs, it could be enough to smash Putin's propaganda machine once and for all. You can learn more about the harsh realities facing the Russian army in this video, which looks at how some soldiers are now being sent into battle without even the most basic of equipment, thrown into the meat grinder with zero chance of survival. Alternatively, check out our detailed breakdown of how and why Russia's once fearsome fleet has utterly fallen apart and no longer poses any credible threat to Kyiv's defenders.